So I did record it. I hope you're able to listen to it. And so today we will pick it up on Daf Yud Zayin, and we'll get into it because it's not the easiest stuff, though it's not the hardest. So yesterday, essentially the discussion that we ended the day with was that the Mishnah said the following statement. The Mishnah said, Le'olam shochatin, which can mean a lot of different things. Le'olam means forever or at any time or something like that. And yesterday we tried to understand it in the context of historically whether eating meat was allowed or not allowed, right? And the first opinion was Rabbi Shmuel, who said that when the Jewish people went into Eretz Yisrael, before they went into Eretz Yisrael, they were not allowed to eat meat, what's called basar ta'ava. They couldn't eat meat that was not a korban. They just felt like eating. When they got into Eretz Yisrael, the Torah says, "Oh, you can eat basar ta'ava." You might have thought that after they left Israel, or when the temple was destroyed and there's no more Beit HaMikdash, that they no longer can eat meat, and that's why the Mishnah says you always do shechita. And the problem with that, the Gemara said, was that should say you always do shechita and eat, not you always do shechita, right? So then we said yesterday it's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Akiva seems to have a different opinion. In many ways, he argues, though not entirely, which is that before the Beit HaMikdash, the Jewish people could not eat did not have to do shechita. They could even eat what's called basar nichira. And basar nichira, now Rashi gives a couple different explanations for nichira. Here he implies that it means that you, instead of shechting the animal where you cut across the simanim, you basically gut the animal. So you go and you just like essentially cut down from the throat straight down the middle of the animal, meaning you kill it in another way, which might be a more natural way, I guess. I don't really know why, but anyway, so it's a different way, basically killing an animal without shechita. And that before the Beit HaMikdash, that was permitted. And then when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they said, no, no, no. Only way you can ever eat meat now is if you do shechita properly. When they left Israel, or when the temple was destroyed, you might have thought you can go back to being allowed to eat meat without shechita. Kamashma in our Mishnah, that you in fact have to have shechita in order to eat meat, even nowadays. Excuse me. And that's what we're up to at which line is it? It is around, it's a two dots, around 10 lines down. So therefore it says, the kach shanino le'olam shochatin, that even today you have to do shechita. Says the Gemara now, at the two dots, b'maika miflagi, right? What's the machloket of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva? So the machloket is, when the Torah, the pasuk that we're dealing with is in Dvarim, and it says, when you get into Israel and you have large boundaries, you can eat meat. You can, I'm sorry, and you want to eat meat, you have to do shechita, right? So one understands that to mean you weren't allowed to eat meat before, you can eat meat now. Rabbi Akiva makes it sound like you were allowed to eat meat, you didn't even have to do shechita, and now you have to do shechita. So what's the machloket? Rabbi Akiva savar, Rabbi Akiva holds bisar tava lo itzar klal. That even originally in the midbar, when they were in the desert, there was no prohibition on eating meat because you were hungry. If you had a chicken, we'll take out chickens for a second, you had a small sheep and you were hungry, you shechted and have a big barbecue. And therefore, when you get into Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to tell me, oh, you can now eat meat. You were always allowed to eat meat. Rabbi Shmuel savar b'sar nechira lo ishri kal. Rabbi Shmuel holds the opposite way, which is that there was never a time where you could eat meat that wasn't shechted properly. And so if you eat that meat in the desert, that would have been prohibited too. So Bishmal Rabbi Shmuel, going to Rabbi Shmuel, who says that the issue is that you weren't allowed to eat meat before, and now you can eat meat that's called b'sar tava. Hainu dichtiv v'shacharet ben abakar. That's why when it says back in the beginning of Vayikra, it says you bring a cow, ben abakar, a bull, to the Beit HaMikdash, you shecht it. So I understand, according to Rabbi Shmuel, you always needed shechita. El Rabbi Akiva, maish v'shachat. Why does the Torah say in Vayikra, which is talking about the desert, that you do shechita? According to Rabbi Akiva, you didn't have to do shechita until you got into Israel. So you don't have to do shechita. You could just kill the animal, save the harag. And just no, no, no. You misunderstood Rabbi Akiva. Kadashim shani. So kadshim, karbanot always needed shechita. What Rabbi Akiva was saying is that outside of the Beit HaMikdash, outside of the Mishkan, you didn't need to do shechita. Okay, let's go to the next pasuk. Right? Remember Moshe, we're gonna have this in a couple weeks, depending on where you are, what country you're in. But Moshe says to Hashem, how am I gonna get food for them? All the Jewish people want is they're starving, they want food. And so Moshe says, the tzon ubakar yishachet lachem. It's a question, right? Will I have enough tzon and bakar to shecht for the Jewish people? But why do you use the word shechita? right? According to Rabbi Akiva. El Rabbi Akiva, my hatzon v'habakar yishached lahem. Why does Torah say, how Moshe says to God, how do I shecht the enough animals? Yinacher lahem mibayle. If you don't need to do shchita in the desert, you could do nichira, the stabbing or cutting of the animal. Why don't you use that verb? Says well, it's the same. That's what we mean by shchita. Nichira shalahen zui shchitatan. Right? Shechita just means slaughtering the animal. It doesn't tell you how to do it. We have a whole bunch of assumptions in Masechet Chulin about how to do shechita, as we've learned already. They're really halach l'Moshe Sinai, right? So the real question is not so much how you do shechita, it's what is called shechita. And maybe in the desert, nechira was called shechita. So that is the explanation of Rabbi Akiva. Okay. What are we up to? I see we are 7 to the last of the intermediate lines, the first word on the line. So remember, we have the machloket, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel from yesterday about what was permitted in the desert. According to Rabbi Shmuel, nothing was permitted except for karbanot. When they get into Eretz Yisrael, the Torah says, oh, you can eat meat whenever you feel like it. You just have to do shechita, right? According to Rabbi Akiva, it's the opposite. In the desert, you not only could eat anything you wanted, but you didn't even need to do shechita. You could do nechira, which is another way to stab or kill the animal. When they get into Israel, that's where the pasuk says, "Oh, you want to eat meat? Make sure you do shechita the way you do it for karbanot." According to Rabbi Akiva, karbanot always needed shechita, but other animals did not in the desert. Says the Gemara, well, okay. So now with those two opinions, Bishlama the Rabbi Yishmael, I understand according to Rabbi Yishmael, Hainu Ditznan. I understand now you have a Mishnah, right? And this Mishnah is describing essentially what happens to the mitzvah of Kisoy Hadam. Yeah, remember that if you shecht an animal, if it's a behema, you don't have to cover the blood. But if it's a chaya or an oaf, we'll get to the chaya, is what we're talking about. A wild animal, you have to cover the blood. Okay, says the Mishnah later. Hashochet v'nitznabla biyado. Let's say you shecht an animal and it becomes an nevela, meaning you did a shechita improperly. You put the knife in the wrong place. You realize too late the animal's a nevela. Okay, or so it's not a kosher. You can't eat it. V'hanocher, or you do nichira, which is this other kind of shechita of stabbing the animal. V'hami'aker. Remember, ma'aker was where one of the problems of shechita is if you pull out the trachea or the esophagus instead of cutting it, you just pull it out. Patur milechasot. In those cases, because the animal can't be eaten, you basically don't have to cover the blood, because covering the blood is a step in eating the animal. If you're not going to eat the animal, there's no mitzvah to cover the blood, right? Says the Gemara, but according to Rabbi Akiva, remember nechira would be kosher in the midbar. El Rabbi Akiva, my patur milechasot. Why don't you have to cover it if we say nechira is a type of shchita, basically? Says where? Well, it was originally a type of shechita, but nowadays it's not. However, itzar, right? Since now the Torah said when you get into Eretz Yisrael, you have to do shechita. Nechira no longer is considered to be something that would be mechayev you in kisoy hadam. So that's not a good question. Says Gemara, okay, now I got the other way. Bishma the Rabbi Akiva, where are we? The fourth to last of the narrow lines. I understand according to Rabbi Akiva, remember Rabbi Akiva's opinion is that you're always allowed to eat meat, no vegetarian requirement. In the desert, you didn't have to do proper shechita. When you get into Eretz Yisrael, you have to do shechita. So Bishmal Rabbi Akiva Damar Basar Ta'ava Lo Itzar Klal. According to Rabbi Akiva says that food that you eating for desire was never prohibited. Hainu Dichtiv. That's why it says, right, there's a very interesting pasuk which says, when it's talking about it's talking about eating meat that you want to eat, it says, Ach kasher ye'achal tatzvi v'etayal kein tochlenu. Right? According to, remember, it says when you get into Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to eat meat, just like you would eat a tzvi, a deer, or an ayal. Gazelle is how they translate one of them. I never can tell, but you know how you would eat these wild animals that are kosher. Came to chlema, so you can eat domestic animals. So I understand, according to Rabbi Akiva, that's a really great analogy. That remember, wild animals never brought on the mizbeach, never brought on the mishkan. You might have thought that regular animals like cows would have to be brought in the Mishkan. Pasuk saying, eat them the way you would eat any wild animal, right? That can't be brought as a carbon. El Rabbi Yishmael, what's the point of Rabbi Yishmael? How can you say, eat them like a tzivayal gufa mihavishari? How in the world do you know that you're allowed to eat tzivayal? Rabbi Yishmael just told us you have to not eat meat in the midbar, except for karbanot. So if you can't eat meat except for karbanot, maybe you can never eat things that are not a carbon, like a tzvi and ayal. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel never said that. So take a step back. Rabbi Shmuel did not say you've got to be vegetarian. All he was saying was, Ki asar rachmana, when the Torah prohibits you from eating meat that you just want to eat, that's if it could be brought as a carbon. Behema dechazia lahakrava, an animal that could be brought as a carbon. And again, the rationale, as we discussed yesterday, or at least I recorded for yesterday, is that if something can be brought as a carbon in the Mishkan, you're all in the Midbar, when you're close to the Mishkan, bring it to the Mishkan because that is close to you and it's accessible and it's the right way to do things. But when you get into Israel and you live very far away, you can't necessarily get to the Mishkan. But chaya, de lo chazila grava, but a wild animal, which is never brought as a carbon, there was never a prohibition of eating it because you have to bring to the Mishkan because you can't. So then, lo asarachmana, there the Torah never prohibited you from eating these chaya even in the Midbar. And so therefore, Rabbi Yishmael's not being that extreme. You could eat hot dogs. They just have to come from your deer. Okay. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now up to the second line, and this is a very interesting question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Asked Rabbi Yirmiyah, remember, according to Rabbi Akiva, you didn't need to do shchita on animals to eat outside of the Beit HaMikdash, outside of the Mishkan in the Midbar when you're in the desert. Okay, you can kill an animal with nechira. Let's call nechira. He keeps using the word stabbing. Again, Rashi is different. Sometimes he says strangulating, but let's say basar nechira. Excuse me. So, in ancient times, I guess today too, they obviously didn't, they had to store their animals and they had very advanced techniques as much as they could for keeping meat good or at least preserved for a long period of time. So let's say the question that probably crosses everyone's mind, right before you leave the midbar, you buy a big order of meat and you get, 10 salamis of basar nechira. So it's meat that was not shechted, according to Rabbi Kiva. You don't need to have shechita, but you don't need that in the midbar. You then go into Israel, and all of a sudden there's a requirement to have shechita, but your meat, your salami, comes from the desert when you didn't do shechita. So can you eat that meat? Okay. Now this is a very local problem, right? It only happened one time, but that was obviously the Gemara loves to do this for intellectual reasons. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, a varei b'sar nechira shechnisu Yisrael imahem la'aretz mahu. If you brought in with you a whole package of meat that was not kosher meat in Israel, but was kosher meat in the desert, what's the status? Can you eat it or not? So says Gemara, well, Amat. Well, when are you talking about? Meaning you crossed the Jordan to get into Israel. If you're talking about the 7 years that they were fighting wars to conquer Israel, there were actually no halachot whatsoever. You can do whatever you wanted. Why? Hashta devar tamei ishtarile. They were allowed to eat totally non-kosher things, non-treif things, right? Devar tamei, like a pig. Dichtiv, because the pasuk says you're going to go into Israel and you're going to find batim mileim kol tuv. You're going to find houses full of everything good. And what does everything good mean? I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Rav. Kutlei dechaziri. That means the bacon, right? I don't know if bacon's the right word, but kotel means the wall, the side, the flank of a pig, right? So what it tells you is that you were allowed to they were fighting a war, they didn't have rules, whatever the reason was, it's really quite a fascinating thing. But clearly, during those years that they were getting into Israel, according to this opinion, they didn't have to worry about eating only certain things. So obviously, if you can eat, even Rashi calls them, Rashi's got a word in French, I don't know if Miriam, if this means anything, chazirim yiveshim shekorim bekunish. But anyway, so that was what they were allowed to eat anything they wanted according to this. So what do you mean?
That's,
What's your question? Sorry, Miriam.
that's really surprising given that the Torah specifically says you're not supposed to eat these particular animals.
Right. No, 100%. I mean, again, this is a little bit tricky, how you understand this, but either you could say they were fighting a war and they didn't have an opportunity. Anyways, but clearly that's what the Gemara is saying, is they can eat any kind of meat during that time.
Did you say
Um,
Bekunish?
yeah, that's a Rashi. Do you have the Rashi?
I mean, it's like bacon. It's a mouth.
Right. Okay.
It's
I
all
guess
the
that's
same.
it. Right.
I mean, that's all I can think of.
Okay. So this is quite a surprising thing. Yep, Rashi, I guess that's exactly you're right. Wow. Okay, anyways, well, why would you ask a question about basar nechira? It's better than bacon, right? So it must be not during those 7 years. It must be ali achar mikan, right? After those years, right? Meaning you kept your salami for a long time. I guess it wasn't really salami. I'm saying whatever they preserve their meat. This is a theoretical question for a 10-year-old, piece of meat. So is it kosher? Now, Some people say, no, it's even during the time. L'olam b'sheva shekivshu. It's even during that time. It's not that you could eat anything you wanted during that time. Ki ishtri lo shlal shel goyim. The Torah said specifically, you can eat the things you capture from the goyim, including bacon. But didhu lo ishtri. It doesn't mean you can eat everything you want. It just means you're allowed to go into the houses and capture it and take it. Which again, how you understand this theologically, I don't know, but quite a fascinating halacha. Teku, and we actually don't resolve this question. So although it was very theoretical, we didn't come out with an answer. So okay, that is the answer, or at least where we got to the question. Says Rabbah now, 7 lines from the bottom, first one on the line. Amar Rabbah, right? Says Rabbah. Now, the truth is that none of this, if you think about our two Mishnayot in context, meaning the first Mishnah and the second Mishnah, it doesn't really add up. What does it mean it doesn't add up? Shanita, you taught in the first Mishnah, Hakol shochatin, ula olam shochatin, right, ula olam shochatin. We already learned everyone can do shchita, and for always, according to Rabbi Akiva, you need to do shchita. But bikol shochatin mai mishanitle. Why are you repeating, right? Why are you while you're repeating, how do you explain? How do you understand the third explanation of you can shecht with everything, right? The chitem, now we already answered this yesterday. We said you can use any implement you need to shecht, anything that's sharp. The chitem, what the Mishnah is saying is you can use anything to shecht, meaning bein betzor, whether it's a sharp piece of stone, or bein beschuchit, it's glass, bein bekrumit shel kanar, it's the reeds. And we talked yesterday, not all reeds, but sharp, dried reeds you can use. Then the Mishnahs, the 3 clauses in the Mishnah, then are not the same, right? Because 2 of them are then referring to the people who do shchita and the people who have to have their food shechted, and the third is referring to the object that you use for shchita, right? So it says Rabbah, ihanach b'shochatim. Sorry, I don't know if I read all the words. Hadumya dahanach katani. It's similar to the other ones, meaning it implies they're the same kind of principles. And you should then say hanach b'shochatin. If the other 2 rules are applying to the people doing shchita, then the third rule should be the same. Hanami b'shochatin. And ihami b'nishchatin, if the third rule is referring to the object you use to do shchita, the knife, then the other rule should be hanami b'nishchatin. Ella Amar Rava, says Rava, I disagree, and I think everything in the Mishnah is referring to the way you do shchita, meaning not the people who eat the meat, but how you have to do shchita. And this is how I would read it. Hakol shochatin, the first hakol shochatin is to tell you, remember there's 2 Mishnayot, hakol shochatin. One is latuye kuti. One is we had in the first Mishnah, we had the first discussion, even a kuti is allowed to do shchita. Remember we had the whole discussion, what a kutim gerei arayot, and are you worried? This is Rava's opinion that he had earlier, that a kuti is kosher for shchita. Of course, if someone's watching and we know it's okay. Chada latuye Yisrael mumar. One is including Yisrael who doesn't follow all the mitzvot, who was learned before. That's okay, as long as we again know that they're doing the right thing. Li'olam shochatin, that tells you, you always do shchita, not you always have to do shchita and eat the meat, because then it will be referring to people eating it, not to people doing shchita. It's actually referring to something about the shchita, meaning bein bayom, bein balayla, that you shecht not for all time, but at any time of the day and any place, whether it's during the day, whether it's at the night, whether it's bein b'rosh hagag, bein rosh hasfina. Remember, you can do it you have to do it, even if you're on the hills, even if you're on the top of the boat where it looks like you might be doing avodah zarah because of the boat gods, etc. Always, you have to always do shchita. And the last one then is bakol shochatin. You always use something for shchita, meaning anything that's sharp. Bein b'tzor, bein b'zchuchit, bein b'krumit shalkana, whether it's a stone, it's glass, whether it's the reed. All of these things are kosher for shchita because they're sharp and they're able to cut and do the shchita properly. Now the Mishnah continued and said, chutz mi magal katsir v'hamegera. The exceptions, what can you not use, is something called a magal katsir. And I don't know if you guys have Gemaras that have pictures, I don't, but so you have to, I imagine some of these things based on what I've learned, but these are obviously objects and implements. And magal katsir literally means a sickle that you harvest with. And it's a special kind of thing, because obviously harvesting grain is a unique thing because they're not very stiff, right? So you don't cut through grain the way you cut through something that's taut. So you have to basically catch the grain and then cut it, right? And so they had special implements that were notched in a way that sort of the grain got caught together and then it got sliced through. So that's a magal katsir, and that's not kosher for shchita. We'll see why, but mainly because it basically, instead of cutting, it catches the neck of the animal and it rips instead of cutting through it. So that's not permitted. And megera, which we translate as a saw, meaning it has indentations, and again, the same thing. Instead of actually cutting it, you are ripping, you're pulling it, and that's not kosher. Now, of course, there are a billion variations on different kinds of knives that are sharp on one end and soft on the other end. And, there are many we're going to get into today. Again, I don't have pictures, but we're going to get into today a kind of knife. Miriam's got, I know. We only see the Golden Gate Bridge, Miriam. You're also muted. Anyways, okay, we're going to get there. But the point I will say, we're going to get into a lot of these details. It'll become a little bit clearer, maybe not perfectly clear, but you can imagine that, and just take a saw, for example, that has, basically a saw is a flat piece of metal, right? And then you cut indentations into it. You cut out little boxes in it that are notches, and they're very small, right? A couple millimeters, but they basically catch everything and cut it. You can have some of those being very sharp and some of them being very dull, so that you can cut or not cut. So now, Avua de Shmuel, remember Shmuel's father always lived in Bavel, right, for a very, very long time. And when Shmuel's
I sent it in the group.
Oh, thank you.
WhatsApp.
Thank you. So Shmuel's father was a long time Babylonian, as they put it. And thank you. Okay, it's great. It's great pictures. So we'll keep going, though. We'll see. Shmuel's father, he lived in Bavel, right? So he didn't have the advantage of having all the experts locally. So what he would do was he would be pagam v'shadar. He would make a defect in a knife to test it out, and he would then send that. He would get a shipment and send 10 knives to Israel and say, "Can you guys evaluate? Is this one okay? Is this one okay?" It's very, very practical way of actually figuring out what the halacha is about different knives. So he would be pagam v'shadar. He would keep making defects in knives and then sending them to Eretz Yisrael to get an opinion. So they, I guess, got sick of the knives arriving in the Beit Midrash, and Sholchole, they sent him a message saying, "Listen, you don't need to send us all your knives. Kim megera shaninu." The point we learned in the Mishnah is that if it's like a megera, like a saw, then it's a problem. The problem with the saw is that the teeth, right? And Miriam showed the picture, but you can obviously have many, many different kinds of pictures. They point upwards, meaning that when you pull the knife back and forth, it rips. Anything that rips is a problem. Tana Rabbanan. Now let's look into a Braita about some of these cases. So says the Braita, turn to Daf Yud Zayin Amabet, Sakin sheyesh ba pegimot harbe. If you have a knife that has many different pegima literally means imperfections, right? So it's got notches, meaning it's probably been damaged or broken. Everyone has knives. You cut on something, it's hard. So it's got all these imperfections in it. Tidon kimegera, you treat it like a saw, and it's pasul for shchita, because since you have so many different imperfections, as you pull the knife across the simanim, it's going to catch and it's going to be pasul. But she'ein ba'el pegima achat, if it only has one abnormality. And if you look at Miriam's picture, she showed some where there's just one area that's not smooth in the knife, right? Again, the picture is probably expanded, 100-fold. That if you have one small area like that, which is not smooth in the knife, then it depends on what kind of imperfection it is. If it's ogeret, okay, and ogeret means it catches, it comes together, then it means that it's pasul, because then the knife will catch the animal and it will be pasul. But if it's misuchsechet, then it's ksher. If it's misuchsechet, I'm going to translate that in a minute, then it's kosher. Ask the Gemara, what do those words mean? Hechidami ogeret, hechidami misuchsechet. What's a notch that's ogeret, and what's a notch that's misuchsechet? Amar Rebbe Eliezer, says Rebbe Eliezer, ogeret mishtei ruchot. And ogeret is where something is sharp on both sides, meaning, again, imagine you have a knife and you cut out an area, I'll call it a U, even though it could, of course, be a very elongated U. If it's sharp on both sides, meaning as you go in and as you come out, it's going to rip it on both sides, that would be pasul. But if it's misuchsechet, it means min ruach achat. It means one edge essentially is dull, and so it's not going to cut. And one edge of this notch is sharp. And that's okay, right? Because, why is that okay? So we're going to see in a second, that must be okay because basically you just cut through one time and you don't rip anything beyond that. Says, and the Gemara is going to ask that question. What do you mean? Now, why is it puzzle if you're using a knife that has basically two sharp indentations, or two sides of the indentation are sharp? It's because Morsha Kama Machlish, because we're worried that the first edge, the first sharp side is going to, Machlish literally means weakens, but it will cut through the skin of the neck, right? Remember, before you get to the simanim of an animal, the animals have very thick necks, right? Especially big animals. And so I've got to cut through the hair is probably not the issue, but the skin and the cartilage and all of that, the cartilage, the skin and the fats, and then get to the actual simanim, to the actual trachea. So if you have basically two sharp kind of pulls on your notch, the first one will get through the surface, and the second one will then pull on the simanim and make it puzzle. Morsha batra buzza. The second one will, buzza means it'll pull it basically, right? So that's the second one will rip the simanim because it's not a smooth edge, it's a jagged edge. And because you have two components to it, one will get through the surface and one will puzzle the animal. Says the Gemara. So therefore, if it's only one area of jagged, one area of cutting, it won't be a problem. But that's why it's not true either. Because meruach achad nami, even if it's only abnormal on one side, chorfa disachina machlish. Forget about this cut, right? The rest of the knife is going to weaken it, right? You've got a long knife. It's a foot-long knife, 12-inch knife. If you've got 4 inches of it that are normal, and then you've got this pegima, this abnormality, why don't you say that the first 4 inches will cut through the skin of the animal, and then the siman will catch on this single abnormality, right? So why don't you say that chorfa de sakina machlish, that the sharpness of the knife will weaken the animal, meaning will cut through the surface level of the animal, and then morsha baza, the one abnormality will cause a ripping of the simanim. Says where you're right. That would be a big problem if the notch, if the abnormality was in the middle of the knife. The case here is dikaim aresha de sakina. You're talking about where the abnormality is at the tip of the knife. So if the abnormality is at the tip of the knife, then when you start cutting with this knife, the abnormality cuts through the skin, and when you get to the actual siman, it's a normal part of the knife, and therefore it's kosher. Says more, okay, but that's only one direction. What about when you come back, right? Sov ki azla machlasha ki atya baza. When you go, you weaken, you open up the area of the trachea, and when you come back, you rip it off. So why isn't that a problem? Kigon shaholich v'lo hevi. You're right. We're talking about the very specific case where you go one way, right? You only cut, it's a sharp enough knife that you cut through the animal in one smooth action, not coming back. And then, as long as the abnormality is at the tip of the knife and it's one-sided, you don't have to worry that it's going to cause the simanim to be puzzle. So that's the very specific halacha and where it's permitted. Says Rava, just to summarize that a little bit. Again, Rava's not arguing, so I got to get to the next page. Here we go. Says Rava, we are at the second to last narrow line. Shlosh midot b'sakin. There are 3 rules, three types of behaviors or halachot of abnormalities in a knife. First of all, ogeret, if it's a kind that catches and that is going to rip out the simanim, lo yishchot. You can't shecht with that knife, and if shachat shchitato psula, and if you do, and you say, oh no, I think I got the sharp part of the knife, we have to assume it's puzzle. You have to throw away that animal. It's not kosher. Misuchsechet, remember misuchsechet was the middle case, or it's really the second case, where it's only at the tip of the knife, it's an abnormality, and it's only in one direction. Then lo yishchot b'lechatila, you shouldn't use it because you may come to catch the wrong part of the animal with it. But if you do use it and you say, I'm confident that I did it properly, shchitato kshera, then shchita would be kosher. If olav yored b'sakin, if the abnormalities are on the sides basically of the sakin, they go up and down the side, meaning they're not in the sharp part of the knife that you're cutting with, then you don't have to worry about it at all. Then where am I? Then then you could check with it even originally. And the reason for that is that, as Rashi explains, the Gemara explains that it's because you basically don't have any sharp parts. You just have abnormalities, meaning a knife does not have to be smooth. It just can't have parts that are sharp enough to cut and to rip that's outside of the knife. But even if there are pegimot, even if there's a large sort of crack in your knife, that could be kosher as long as it's not sharp and it doesn't cause ripping of the animal's simanim. So that's the three categories. Now, Amr le Rav Huna, where am I? Amr le Rav Huna, Breit Rav Nechemya, Rav Ashi. Now, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nechemya, said to Rav Ashi, I don't really know what you're talking about. Amr Lan, you told us, Mishmei de Rava, Misuchsechet Psula. You told us the name of Rava, that a knife that's Misuchsechet, remember it's Misuchsechet, is this knife that basically catches the animal, is going to be puzzle, right? But Amr Rava, but we have another saying of Rava, that Misuchsechet Kshera, that Misuchsechet is kosher. So you're telling us one thing, we heard something else, explain it to us. And as the Gemara recently just pointed out, Lokasha, it depends on whether you go back and forth or you go in one direction, right? One motion. Because remember, the knife that's Misuchsechet, as you move, you don't catch anything. If you came back, you would catch, right? I mean, the first thing you catch, you don't go when you keep going. And if you go in one direction and it's the tip of the knife, then it would be okay according to Rava. But if it's holich, so if you're holich v'hevi, if you go back and forth, it's possible. If you're holich v'lo hevi, then it would be kosher. So again, it all just depends on whether or not you're going to catch the simanim and rip them with the action you do. Amr le Ravacha Breder Ravashi. One last question for today in this topic. Said Ravacha Breder Ravashi, we are sixth wide line. What about a case that's damya l'sa'asa? What if you have a knife that's similar to a sa'asa? Rashi gives a word here, arishta. I don't know what that means, but basically what he says is that it's like the hairy part of the shibolim, of the stalks, right? It's not smooth. And when you put your fingers on it, you get this you feel it like bush burrowing into you, right? So it's not smooth, but it's not sharp enough, right? It's not like a pigam. It's just that it's a very sort of, I wouldn't say jagged, but it's like a rough edge. So what about in that case, right? Where it's not smooth, but there's no actual indentations in it? Can you use that for shchita? And Amr Rav Ashi said, that sounds delicious. Man yavlan mi bisra v'achilinan. Use that knife, cut up a steak, and give it to me to eat. Meaning, that's perfect. There's no problems using that kind of knife, as long as it doesn't have actual notches or jagged areas in it. Again, practically speaking, we're going to see in a second how you check your knives, but this of course is very, very vague, these Gemaras, because we don't know what all these things are, and it's better to have a very sharp knife that's smooth. Says Rav Chisda, now how do you know you have medigat sakim min Torah? How do you know that you have to check a knife min Torah? Shneimar, as it says, v'shechatetem bezeh v'achaltem. When it's a very interesting story, when the people came to Shaul, they were starving, and Shaul said, take this knife and shecht, and you can eat. So why is Shmuel giving them a knife, right? Pshita, all right. So sorry, why is Shmuel giving them a knife? Because Shmuel was the leader, he was the king. Sorry, I said Shmuel. Shaul was the leader, he was the king, and so he was handing them a kosher knife. So you see, you have to have a kosher knife. Says for 1 second. Pshita, I understand the kivan dechinakav treifa. I understand that if you make a hole in the siman, in the trachea, the animal becomes a treifa. So boy bedika you need. If you make a hole in the neck, it's a treifa. And Shaul was telling them use a proper knife. But how do I know that you've got to go and show a knife to the chacham? Ba'aya bedika lechacham karmina. My question was, how do you know you need to have a show it to the chacham? Says Gemara, what are you talking about? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, we said you don't have to show it to the chacham. We had this Gemara last week, right? Lo amru la'arot sakin the chacham el mipnei kvodo shel chacham. You don't really have to show a knife to the chacham. It's just done for respect. It's done to show them courtesy. Says Gemara, you're right. Obviously, midrabanan, it's really only a drabanan thing to show a knife to the chacham out of courtesy. The pasuk is just providing some sort of support that this is something that was done, not that it's required to be done. So you don't really need to show it to a chacham if you're comfortable your knife is kosher. Obviously, if you have a doubt, you should show it to someone in order to look into it. Now, how do you check your knife, right? So now we get to practical tactics. You've got a knife. Remember, if it has notches in it, if it's cut in it, it's a problem. If it's rough, it's okay. How do you know how to classify a knife? So b'ma'arava batkile b'shimsha. In Eretz Yisrael, they would check it in the sun, right? Which is a couple ways to do that. The thing about it, you can hold the knife up to the sun and you could see right? If there's like if things are shifted a little, the sun will catch and will reflect off the knife. So that's one explanation. So if it's not perfectly smooth, you'll get a reflection in that area. Bin Nahar Da'a Batkle B'Maya. In Nahar Da'a, which is on the water, they checked it with the water, which, I don't know if anyone's done that. You take a knife and you roll it along the surface of the water, and if there's a defect in the knife, you'll see a line, right? Some surface water going that basically is interfered with by that abnormality in the knife. So you can check it by pulling it along the water. There's another explanation is that you can do it by dropping a drop of water at the top and watching it roll down. And if it stops or gets caught or dissipates, it means something was interfering with its path. Rav Sheshet Batkile B'Reish Lishne, Rav Sheshet would take it and rub it against the tip of his tongue, which is a little bit dangerous. Maybe they'd wash it before they did shechita, right?
Wasn't Rav Sheshet blind?
Yeah, it's true. So I guess he had very good sense in his tongue. And that's a good point, Charlie. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Batkile B'Chutz Sa'ara. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov would use a hair basically to run a hair over it and gently on the surface. And if it got caught, you would know that there was an abnormality on the surface. So these were clearly very, very sensitive checks on the surface of a knife to see how smooth it was. Now, B'Sura Amri, in Surah they used to say, you know what? Bisra Achla. What you want to do is you want to take the knife and consume or cut or eat the flesh. So the way to test a knife is not in your hair, it's in meat. Bisra livdika, you should check it with flesh, right? And so the ways to do that are either using your fingers, right? Your fingertip, which is your skin, or your tongue, which would obviously be meat as well. Rav Papa said, you gotta do all three. Tzricha bidika abisra, you have to check in on your flesh, meaning on your tongue. Atufra, on your nail, right? And many explain because the nail is like cartilage, and so it's actually a little thicker than your skin, right? And sometimes you pick up things there that you don't pick up elsewhere. Vatlata ruchata, and you actually have to do it on all three sides of the knife. Now, what are three sides? You have the sharp edge, you have the two sides, right? Because if there's any abnormality on the side of the knife, that'll catch the neck of the animal as well. So you basically have to do the surface of the knife and each side. So it's two checks on three sides, right? Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Now says Ravina to Ravashi, Amri Lan Rav Sama Braid from Misharshia Mishmach. Ravina said to Ravashi, we heard from Rav Sama Braid of Misharshia in your name, right? That you said the Amrit Lan Mishmei de Rava, that you quoted Rava as saying that you need to do tzricha bedika abisra, you have to check it on your skin or your tongue, let's say, tufra, and on your fingernail, tlata ruchata, and on all three sides of the knife. And Amrale, so Rava responded and said, no. Abisra vatufra amri. I said you do have to check your skin, meaning put against your tongue or your finger or your fingertip. The tufra amri and the tufra and the nail, I said, but atlata ruchata lo amri. I never said you have to do all three sides of the knife. Okay. Now others say Ikad Amri. What he said to them was, no. I did say that halacha bisra vatufra vatlata ruchati amri, but I didn't quote in the name of Rava. Mishmei de Rava lo amri. You're misquoting me. You said I said this name of Rava. I didn't say the name of Rava. I said it on my own. Now Ravina, I didn't skip anything, right? Sorry, Ravina. Where am I? Sorry. Ravina of Rav Acha Bar Rava Haviyatvi Kamei de Ravashi. Now, once Ravina and Rav Acha Bar Rava were sitting in front of Ravashi, you can see a lot of very practical cases here because when it comes down to it, especially when we don't have big slaughterhouses, the question of shechting an animal was one of the most practical questions, right? You had to eat. No, you had to do it. They're complicated halachot. So we see a lot of these examples where people were sort of practically halach lemaisa. What do we do? Right? So this is a case of Ravina and Rav Acha Bar Rava. We're sitting in front of Ravashi. Ati sakin the kamei Ravashi livdika. A knife came to Ravashi to check. And Amalei Rav Acha Bar Rava, he gave it to his student. This was how you do shimush, right? How you do apprenticeship. He gave it to Rav Acha Bar Rava and said, Bitka, check it. Let's see what you can do. So what he did was, he was very scared probably, but Batka atufra va'abisra v'atlata ruchata. He did all the checking. He did on his tufra, on his nail, abisra, on his skin or his tongue, and he did it on all three sides of the knife, meaning the sharp edge and the two sides. And Amrilay, Ravashi said to him, Yasher, you did a good job. You passed the test. V'chein Amar Rav Kahana, and this is how Rav Kahana said to do it. So it was a practical exam. Now, Rav Yemar said that, I disagree, as we said earlier. And atufra v'abisra tzricha, you need to check the knife edge on your skin and on your nails, but don't worry about the sides. Atlata ruchata lo tzricha, it doesn't matter if the two sides, you have to do the tip, but not the two sides. It doesn't matter if there's an abnormality in the side. Because if you recall, we had a halacha earlier, Milo Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Shmuel. Remember, we had a case where libein sakin, you heated up a knife till it was burning hot, right? V'shachapa, and you did shchita tok shera. The shchita is kosher. Now, why is that kosher? You can't burn an animal. That's obviously not a shchita. And the way we explained it earlier, in the name of Reb Zera Amar Shmuel, was the reason is that the sharp edge of the knife cuts the animal before the heat comes, right? Shechkiduda kodem libuna. The sharp part comes before the heat part, right? And so, Kashlan, we asked, so what if the sharp part comes in? As a knife slices through, the heat from the side of the knife is going to burn and burn the simanim. Ha'ikat stadim. What about the sides? Vamrina, and the answer we gave earlier was that what happens when you cut is basically it opens up, it fillets, right? And we said beit hashchita, where am I? Beit hashchita mirvach ravach, that the space, the area of the shchita gets wider as you cut through. So meaning as you cut, it opens up, and so the hot edges of the knife are not actually touching the simanim. Sachinami, here too, I would say the same halacha, beit hashchita mirvach ravach. I would say the same halacha, that it doesn't matter to me if the sides of the knife have abnormalities in it, because as you cut, as long as the tip, meaning the sharp edge of the knife, doesn't have abnormalities, basically, as you cut through, it opens up, and it never, the trachea and the esophagus of the animal never actually touch the sides of the knife, and you don't have to worry about abnormalities in the side of the knife. You only have to worry about the actual sharp edge of the knife. So that is his, clearly there's a machloket about that, but that is his psak. I'm going to stop here. We're 3 lines to the bottom, 4 lines to the bottom. We're obviously not finished with this sugya because we're going to get into much more about different kind of pigimot. But this is a little tricky. I guess if you have pictures, it's probably a little easier. But even then, clearly those pictures are not to scale, and so the type of knife is quite complex. Yashar koach, everyone. Chodesh tov. We will see you all when I see you.
Yashikah, Shavua Tov, and Mazel Tov again.
Tov, Chodesh Tov,
Thank you all
Al
again.
Tov.